The history of drag racing is largely a collection of small efforts, of ideas that probed what was possible, what could be done, and in so many ways, each of them actually helped to move the sport ahead incrementally. Now, there have been some quantum leaps along the way, but by and large, it's been a creeping kind of linear evolution. Engine families, engine locations, suspension layouts and mechanisms, data gathering, all of these things have added up to machines in the modern world that will accelerate from 0 to 340 miles per hour in less than 4 seconds. It's a seeming mix of engineering, science fiction, and unforgiving explosive fuels pushing it all forward. But what if I were to tell you that the most significant performance creation in drag racing history took place in the 1960s, and its first infantile step rewrote what was considered possible at the drag strip? A land missile designed not as much as a machine to change the course of drag racing itself, but a machine with a larger purpose that found the drag strip as its temporary testbed with the intentions to do far greater things at far greater locations. The birth of the hydrogen peroxide rocket car opened a Pandora's box of acceleration potential that were otherwise unknown to humankind at that point. It is possible to pinpoint one car and one moment for this story, and the X-1 is that machine. A part-time chassis builder, an enthusiastic hot rodder, a driver who could wheel anything, and a rocket enthusiast who flunked out of Purdue somehow managed to come together and make a record-setting drag strip terror that was actually a secret rolling test bed for what would later become the fastest car in the world, full stop. Their names were Ray Dossman, Peter Farnsworth, Chuck Suba, and Dick Keller. The cosmos seemingly drew them together to do something great, and they did. This video will center around the X-1 rocket car used on drag strips. Now, as I have alluded to, the X-1 project was the appetizer for the main course that these guys dreamed of and schemed of, a machine famously known as the Blue Flame. The X-1 was their testbed, a toy in comparison, but a toy that taught them the lessons they needed to know how to take the world's land speed record in 1970. Now, every engine needs a spark plug, right? Hey everybody, it's Brian Loans, and you know I love a good deep dive on this channel, and you see the end result of those deep dives, but what you don't see are all the hours spent finding source material, organizing it, and writing 50, sometimes 70 pages of notes by hand, depending on how long the video is, organizing those notes and making something coherent out of it. I love the process, but I never thought I'd be able to streamline it until I found this guy. This is the PLAUD Note. The size of a credit card with 30 hours of recording capability. It is like an AI secretary has come into my life. Not only does this attach to my phone, I can record phone interviews with it straight off the phone. It also does things where I can speak to it. Not only will it transcribe what I tell it, but it will organize and summarize my notes in a way that allows me to now put these stories together more accurately, more quickly, and this is how it can help you in your regular life. If you're sitting in meetings all day, having important phone calls, you're on the go, I'm on the go, and you need the details of these things not only reminded and maybe distributed, but you also need them summarized, this is what the note is for. Now, to go along with the note, there is also the note pin. The note pin and the note function in much the same way. 20 hours of recording capability with that transcription, the organization, and the summarization, also all part of the PLAUD app. And there are 30 hours of available time on the PLAUD Note. These things are great. They're super usable, super friendly, and for me, they have changed the game in terms of making these videos in a much more efficient way. They also have the Ask AI function, which allows you to harness the power of a chat GPT-like force, so you can search your notes, keep your notes organized, and deep dive back into those important topics you know you'll need to revisit. So, beyond all that, what about safety? What about data? Well, the AWS cloud is where the information goes, and that cloud has SOC 2 certifications, HIPAA certifications, and others to make sure that your data stays yours. Go to plaud.ai, use code Brian10 to get 10% off your note. It is a great value, and it's a great product that will help you be more efficient, more accurate, and more organized in your whole life. Hit the link below, go to plaudai.com, code Brian10. Do this. It's great. I promise you're seeing the results right now. Let's go back to the show. In an ironic twist, the engine we're talking about here doesn't, but I want to use this analogy to move forward. Dick Keller was the man who it seems fair to credit in launching the X-1 rocket car project through his own curiosity, brains, and enthusiasm. In the 8th grade, Keller helped form the Igniters Car Club in Chicago. The guy was absolutely eaten up with hot rodding, the Bonneville Salt Flats, and fast cars of the loud variety. As a young man, he had a Cadillac-powered 1939 Ford he often drag raced, and somehow, some way, which I could not totally define, Keller had some ties to Don Garlitz. The man loved the drag strip, and his pursuit of all things technical led him to an education in the field of chemical engineering, or at least the deep study of chemicals. It's hard to discern his level of education, but it is clear to see his concentration, and it was chemical-related. In the early 1960s, Keller was working at the Illinois Institute of Technology Research Institute and studying all kinds of different things, but his most interesting projects worked on rocket propellants and fuels. Now, much of that work was commissioned by NASA during the full-court press of the space program in the 1960s. And like so many young researchers, Keller was living with his wife on a tight budget in a small place, but he was a dreamer. He was an organizer. And most importantly, a hot rodder who went to the drag strip as frequently as possible. He knew the racers, he knew the chassis men, he knew the engine builders. He was in the scene. And for Dick Keller, all of this was in his blood. Ray Dossman had never heard of a drag strip in the early 60s. Racing cars were not appealing to Ray Dossman. He didn't care about pistons and valves and crankshafts and connecting rods. He was a very bright student. He got out of high school and went to the Army Reserves, and Dossman was accepted to Purdue. He went to Purdue in the auspices of getting an electrical engineering degree. There was, however, one pretty large hang-up with this whole program. Dossman really couldn't figure out calculus. And to be an electrical engineer, you need to be good at calculus. Despite how hard he worked, this stifled his education to the point that, despite burrowing deeply into the engineering program, he quit school at Purdue, and he did vow to someday go back and finish the process. In the meantime, he had found an interesting hobby that had morphed into a hardcore kind of experimental passion, and that was rocketry. Dossman was building advanced solid-fuel rockets, making his own fuel from scratch, and working with a pal named Dale Carpenter. It was Carpenter who handed Dossman a book that would change his life forever. The tome was called Rocket Propulsion Elements by George P. Sutton, and this was an amateur rocket fan's Bible. There was chapters about liquid propellants, flight performance, engine systems, charts, graphs, and equations that the reader could use to actively figure out the theoretical performance of their own rockets. Now, don't get it twisted. Ray Dossman didn't want to be a rocket propulsion engineer. He was just into this stuff like Dick Keller was into hot rods. Pete Farnsworth was one heck of a drag racer. He was also running himself ragged. In the early 1960s, he was wrenching as a truck mechanic, building race cars for others, and trying to maintain his own top-fuel dragster in a small shop behind the small Milwaukee house he lived in with his wife Leah. A guy who had 2 years of mechanical engineering experience in college, who left to be a tool and die maker, he ended up being a truck mechanic when the tool and die company went bankrupt. Farnsworth had a reputation for building fast, well-constructed race cars, and he could also wheel them as well. Oddly, after grinding himself into dust working on the top fuel car and keeping a job with overtime, Pete Farnsworth had considered something his rocket engineering brother had brought up. Why not build a dragster with a rocket engine? The idea was perfect, but Pete and his brother kept coming back to one massive issue. The fuel used in liquid rockets at this time in history was horrible stuff. Probably still is. It was unstable, dangerous, and the idea of hauling it into, handling it, and burning it at a packed drag strip was just too much for Pete and his brother to get around. The idea just seemed far too dangerous, and there didn't seem to be enough upside to the danger it presented, both in handling and using the materials. And then there was Chuck Suba. Chuck graduated high school with Pete Farnsworth and his wife Leah. He did a stint in the Marine Corps where he was around jet aircraft, and he had studied mechanical engineering in college. Did he have a degree? I honestly don't know. According to Ray Dossman's telling of the story, Suba lived in Calumet City, Illinois, in a building owned by a crime lord who allowed Suba to live there with his race car seemingly rent-free. Suba's life was drag racing. His life was his dragster, and Dossman claims he slept all day and worked all night on the car preparing for the next race. A simple and Spartan existence, and one completely centered around drag racing. He would be the right man for the job behind the wheel. But we're a long way from there yet. Technically, at this point in the story, none of these people have ever met before. Seriously. We need to go to 1961. It was then that Ray Dossman got a job as a research technician at a place called the Armor Research Foundation, which was later renamed to the Illinois Institute of Technology Research Institute, Department of Redundancy Department. A friend he had made through rocketry suggested he apply to be a research technician at this place, and he did, and he got the job. He found himself working in the chemistry building on all kinds of odd and interesting scientific studies. Now, part of that was handling, studying, and developing liquid rocket propellants. This was valuable stuff and a part of his job that he really seemed to enjoy the most. Among the many people at the Research Institute working on rocket-related stuff, Dick Keller was the closest to Ray and his wife Phyllis. Dick Keller and his wife Nancy were the two people that Ray and his wife Phyllis most often hung out with. In fact, Nancy would even babysit their kids at a time. Now, as mentioned previously, Keller was obsessed with cars. He loved drag racing beyond all else. That's why it only made sense that he'd invite Dossman to the drags to check it out one summer night. Now, Dossman in his book claims it was at Great Lakes Dragway this invitation came to be, and Keller claims in his personal history that it was at Indy where he took Dossman to see drag racing the first time. But either way, in 1963, a reluctant Ray Dossman agreed to go to the drag strip with Keller more as a favor than anything else. He figured basically, it can't hurt to check it out. Confronted with the sights, sounds, and smells of the drag strip for the first time, Dossman was suitably impressed but wasn't really moved by the whole thing. The fuel dragsters were overwhelmingly fun to watch as their own act. The size of the crowd was surprising to him, and the entire experience was something that he had done once and in his own mind never really had to do again. But something did stick with him. An idea. He claims to have told Keller on the way back home that if he were ever to build a dragster, it would be rocket-powered. Considering the power-to-weight ratio, simplicity, and even safety elements, it just made the most sense to him as an objective observer. His interest kicked up a notch when Keller informed him of the existence of jet cars. The fact that there was another thrust-driven style of drag racing machine, and that it was much heavier than the one he wanted to build, quietly reinforced to Dossman that he may actually be onto something here. The conversation continued to the end of the ride, ended on a good note, and Dossman figured that was the end of that. In fact, it was just the beginning. Over the course of the next few months, Keller and Dossman kept talking about this idea of a rocket-powered drag racing car and even venturing beyond that, the ability to create a car that could have the power to capture the world's land speed record. It went from lunchtime theoretical chats to Dossman designing a very teeny tiny liquid propellant rocket engine. This machine, this tiny little engine, was capable of fitting into the palm of a man's hand, and the little rocket was designed to make 25 pounds of thrust per the math gleaned from the previously mentioned George P. Sutton book. Made at night when no one else was around from metal scraps in the bin at the Institute, Keller and Dossman completed the rocket by the summer of 1964. They used a bathroom scale, a 16mm camera, and about a pint of 90% hydrogen peroxide, as well as a supersized order of prayers to fire their liquid rocket. The first attempt began in what was known as a wet start. Shooting peroxide out the end of the rocket, it doused Dossman in 90% liquid hydrogen peroxide and resulted in no thrust. Adjustments were made, and the motor produced 25 pounds of thrust as the math said it should, and they both knew that their teamwork had produced a successful test firing and that their little 25 pounds of thrust could be made 2,500 simply by scaling up the design. It was time to get serious. Through the rest of the summer, the bench racing, the table calculations, and the semi-serious conversation about the rocket motor continued between Dossman and Keller. Keller had talent as a draftsman, so he was able to make drawings to the specs that Dosman came up with, and consulting with engineers and scientists at the Institute, they settled on a 2,500-pound thrust motor as their goal. It was deemed roughly equivalent to 2,000 horsepower, which again is what the math said they would need to get going 200-plus miles per hour on the drag strip. This was all still a hobby project until September of 1964, when Keller and Pete Farnsworth had a chance meeting at Oswego Dragway in Oswego, Illinois. Farnsworth was there running his fuel dragster. Keller was there being Keller, and a resultant conversation changed the course of the entire project. As mentioned, Farnsworth had already been mulling the idea around of a rocket-powered car to replace his fuel dragster because he saw the money the jet cars were making at the time. He also knew there was a load of potential for exhibition machines of another stripe. Also, he figured that it had to have been cheaper to run that than a dragster which consumed his parts, hopes, dreams, and bank account. Farnsworth had been on the verge of buying a turbonique rocket drag axle but never pulled the trigger. Then he was interested in having Dosman and Keller build him his own rocket engine, but ultimately it was Keller who sold him on the idea of being the builder and fabricator of the body and chassis of the X-1. They pledged their help on the weekends and whenever they could get to Milwaukee, about a 2-hour trip from them in Chicago. Farnsworth agreed to take the job, and in that moment, the project went from some theoretical what-if concept to a real thing that required time, a budget, a plan, and a positive outcome so these guys didn't sink every extra penny they had into a loser of an investment. Now, the men split off into various functions. Dosman found that he could buy the needed 90% pure hydrogen peroxide from the FMC Corporation in Tonawanda, New York, and it would come in 30-gallon drums. The only downside is that those drums were $300 a piece, and Dosman was making $300 a month. This was going to be a tight squeeze. A fabrication shop was found that could build the rocket motor to the specs the guys wanted, and they provided their drawings to those specs. Other parts were being assembled to make the car a reality, and an official partnership called DFK for Dosman Farnsworth Keller Enterprises was made, binding the guys legally. By the spring of 1965, Farnsworth had started tacking steel tubing together for the basic layout of the car, and both Dosman and Keller had taken up studying hydrogen peroxide rockets basically full-time. They met with rocket engineers, fuel experts, and people who had designed such rockets for the likes of NASA, and these guys were confirming that they were on the right path and helping them tweak their designs. In May of 1965, Pete, Dick, and Ray formed Reaction Dynamics Corporation. This was done for all the same reasons any partnership forms a corporation for the purposes of taxes, financial organization, and most importantly, limiting personal liability. The fact of the matter was that they were building an unprecedented vehicle that had the potential to be dangerous, and if anything happened, they needed a shield to prevent themselves from being held personally liable. The entire fall of 1965, winter and spring of '66 were concentrated on finishing the car. Rather than a typical dragster-looking creation, Farnsworth had gone in a different design direction. The machine had the resemblance of an Indy car, or even an F1 car. I've not been totally able to discern why this is that they didn't go for a normal full-on looking dragster, but of course it's evident in all the photos and images. The car used independent suspension on all four corners, had a simple but well-crafted cockpit, a plexiglass canopy over said cockpit, and rode on the same kind of tires Indy 500 racers used. It had four-wheel disc brakes, 3 parachutes for safety, and most importantly, it had that rocket motor sitting in the back. What it did not have in July of 1966 was a body yet. Farnsworth had tried to farm that part of the work out to no avail, and so he'd have to form it himself. Weighing 56 pounds and constructed of stainless steel, the motor in the X-1 was unique in human history at that time. It was the first liquid propellant rocket ever made with the intention of powering an automobile. We should now talk about what a hydrogen peroxide rocket is, so you know how that works and why the guys went with this design in the first place. A hydrogen peroxide rocket is basically a steam rocket. Hydrogen peroxide is sent into the rocket motor and passed through a screen that is covered in silver or another material like samarium oxide. The second the peroxide hits that screen, an instantaneous reaction takes place, which causes the peroxide to decompose, shedding its oxygen molecules, and in doing so, rapidly expanding into steam. harnessing that steam in what's called the decomposition chamber and then forcing it out of a nozzle, that creates the thrust, and that thrust forces the vehicle to move. Now, the motor has what amounts to one moving part, and that would be the valve that introduces the peroxide into it. There are pressure regulators used in various places to keep the peroxide coming at the right levels and stuff, but overall, the simplicity of design is so simple, it's almost enough to bring tears to your eyes. In terms of public use, peroxide made the most sense because it's stable, doesn't present explosive or fire hazards, doesn't leave any noxious fumes or risk to spectators, and so long as it's handled with care, even the guys pumping the stuff into the car are at minimal risk. No, it's not as nice as spring water, but it's also not like hydrazine or this other insane stuff guys were messing with back then. The rolling chassis with motor were loaded on the back of a Chevy truck the guys bought to haul this thing around, and they went to Great Lakes Dragaway in 1966. Great Lakes, of course, is in Union Grove, Wisconsin. Broadway Bob Metzler, who owned the place, allowed the guys to come in on a day when they were closed, chain the car to a post, and make the early test on the engine. It worked. The rocket was throttleable, predictable, and operated as they hoped it would. With the car straining against the chains that held it to the post, it seemed like the next logical step was for somebody to actually take it down the track, albeit slowly. The date was July 23rd, 1966. Dosman wanted nothing to do with driving, and after Farnsworth saw the chained-up display, he was out of the seat as well. In fact, the X-1 would end up being the only drag car that Pete Farnsworth ever built that he didn't drive himself. With those two guys out, Keller was placed in the seat by default, given his helmet and gloves, and after cracking the throttle a time or two to make sure the catalyst screen pack was warmed up, he staged the car under its own power. Once the tree flashed, he hit the throttle and the car shot off in a whoosh. Everything worked perfectly. Even in this low-power setting and environment, it was proof positive that their idea was great. Sure, it wasn't a perfect day, but it was close. The car and rocket worked, their design was on the right path, and the future was bright. They had made two 2-second bursts on the racetrack, achieved speeds in the 70 to 80 mile per hour range, and all systems had passed the test. Now, all they needed was a real driver. Chuck Suba was a man ready-made for this job. Completely consumed by drag racing, he ran his own AA fuel dragster, had driven for Art Malone, had built his own early jet car known as the Superjet, and when these guys approached him, he was still running the US-1 jet dragster as an exhibition act. The good news, he was also from Illinois. When Suba first saw the car, he was relatively impressed, but also a mite concerned. He thought it could be too light, too spindly to handle the loads and the G-forces that would be placed upon it, and in considering the fact that those G's would be loading on the car, almost doubling its weight, these were valid concerns. But the fears were allayed when Farnsworth and Dosman went over the design end to end and showed him how the car was built. He was the guy. To seal the deal, they let Suba know that the X-1 was simply the second of a 3-phase project which would eventually culminate with the construction of a land speed racing car powered by a rocket capable of going 1,000 miles per hour. To Chuck Suba, this made it officially impossible to say no. In September of 1966, Chuck Suba tested the still body-free X-1 at Union Grove, and after some shorter attempts, he made the first quarter-mile pull of that car's life, and it was a dandy. 7.19 seconds at 203 miles per hour. Chuck Suba agreed on payment of $500 per event that he drove the car, and Reaction Dynamics hired Ira Leachy as their booking agent to fill dates, help them make some money back with this rolling testbed of a race car known as the X-1. Farnsworth's job through 1966 and into 67 was clear. Get the body finished, painted, and mounted so Suba could make the dates that they had booked their match racing into and that Leachy had helped fill up their calendar with in the upcoming season. No body equals no income, and that would not look good for the guys in the position they were at now. By April, he had completed the work, and the car, odd as it may look to some, and beautiful as it is to others, was done. The guys altered the size of the hydrogen peroxide tank for safety and maybe for some cost control. The peroxide was $15 a gallon, the car used 9.5 gallons per run, and because it was making so much power, they shrunk the tank to make sure it would run out of fuel after 5 seconds. This was done to prevent any sort of a runaway situation, to prevent excess speed, and to keep Suba safe. Effectively, in 1967, the X-1 never finished a quarter-mile run under power, as it was always coasting by that point of the racetrack. The fuel tank was pressurized to 425 psi with nitrogen, and this was done to overcome the 300 psi of pressure in the decomposition chamber. Effectively, the fuel pressure was 125 psi of hydrogen peroxide being shot through the screen and turned into steam. There are some really interesting specs when we talk about the X-1. With Suba in it and a full tank of fuel, the car weighed 1,020 pounds. Without him or fuel, 760 pounds. The main frame rails are 1-inch diameter 028 wall mild steel tubing. The roll cage section used 3/4 inch outside diameter 120,000 thick mild steel pipe. The rocket engine was mounted with a 1 degree of negative angle, meaning that the nose of the rocket was slightly down, and of course the cone was slightly up. This helped to stabilize the car at speed. A 2 to 3 degree forward rake also helped things in the aerodynamic and stability department. HH Products disc brakes lived on the corners, hand-fabricated upper and lower control arms and adjustable shocks were used in the suspension. The rear suspension could be locked out solid when they wanted it to be, and from most of the photos I've seen, the car ran in that configuration most often. This was a completely bespoke creation. There wasn't another one on Earth, and there was not anything else in the sport of drag racing that could hold a candle to its performance. In the 1967 timeframe, the X-1 made a load of appearances around the Midwest. It was at strips in Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, and more. The machine would make low 6-second runs with total ease and often did. The X-1 was so much faster than the jet cars, they mostly refused to race it, forcing the X-1 to either spot them lengths or to simply run by itself. The car set track records everywhere it went. In 1967 at Crown Point, Indiana, the boys might have been actual victims of their own success. The Little Track's timing system came back with a 5.41 second elapsed time after a run, and the speed was listed at 229 miles per hour. This was both an astonishing feat and one that made the X-1 guys groan. With that number being hyped as hard as it was, they would never get another jet car to line up next to him. Even the X-1 boys didn't totally buy that speed and ET number, but they did end up publishing it on their promotional stuff about the car. So, like most drag racers, they wanted it and had it both ways. Now, if you're wondering why they didn't tour the car nationally, I have to remind you again that they were doing all of this as a test bed for a far larger goal. That goal, of course, was a massive project that would see these three, they hoped, building the fastest car in the world. Dick Keller had already begun writing papers to study the concept of a 1,000-mile-per-hour supersonic car. He'd also started working at the Institute of Gas Technology, leading studies and doing research on something known as gas reaction kinetics. The American Gas Association was paying the freight on all of this, and Keller saw an opening. In early 1968, Keller crafted a proposal to the gas industry entitled LNG Goes Supersonic. Of course, LNG stands for liquid natural gas. He tweaked that into a proposal called Setting the New World Land Speed Record with Liquid Natural Gas. These reports and proposals landed on the desks of the right industry executives who were hell-bent on opening up new arenas for LNG use in America. The guys also landed a sponsorship with Rizlone, and the car was known as the Rizlone Rocket, the X-1 car, that is. They promoted the machine in their ads, and the car wore a sticker on the nose. Now, in 1968, the X-1 guys decided to up the ante. They added a larger fuel tank so the car could remain under power all the way to the quarter-mile finish line. The results were instantly astonishing. Speeds of 251, 257, and in October of 1968 at the Jet Car Nationals being held in Oklahoma City, in front of a crowd of influential, powerful, and decision-making gas industry executives, Chuck Suba blasted the X-1 to an elapsed time of 590 at a speed of 265.48 miles per hour. In so many ways, it was the most impressive run in drag racing history to that time. The gas industry executives were absolutely sold. They were all in on the Reaction Dynamics boys chasing the world's land speed record and incorporating the use of LNG into their project. It was the perfect ending to a seemingly perfect phase of the project. Chuck Suba would be the driver for the fastest car in the world. The guys all quit their jobs as their new lives were funded by the gas industry, and their new purpose was to build the world's fastest car with the backing of that entire enterprise. But Chuck Suba wasn't going to be there to see it. On October 13th of 1968, Suba was testing a friend's top fuel car that had been ill-handling at Rockford Dragway in Byron, Illinois. At the quarter-mile finish line, Suba's car moved out of the groove, struck a 55-gallon drum that was placed trackside to indicate the finish line, and crashed hard. He was killed, and the Camelot period of Reaction Dynamics died with him. With a large contract, budget, and responsibility to deliver on the promise of their early work, the trifecta of Farnsworth, Keller, and Dosman still had the magic, but it was far more formal now. The era of experimentation and exploration were over. The pressures of this new project, a car called the Blue Flame, would forever change the relationship that these three men shared. As far as the X-1 went, the car was never raced again on asphalt. X-1 was sold to a man named Tony Fox, who owned, among other things, a snowmobile company. Converted to skis instead of wheels and operated by the legendary Kai Michelson, it set a snowmobile record at some 114 miles an hour in a publicity stunt for the company. After that, it was placed in the corner, undisturbed as far as anyone knows, for decades. The rocket motor was liberated by Michelson and used in a later rocket dragster, which was called the Pollution Packer in the early 70s because Tony Fox also had a business making garbage trucks, hence the name. The numbers created by the X-1 rocket car were stunning in so many ways. Traditional drag racers did not like or even recognize them because they were created by thrust and not by good old romp-and-stomp-and horsepower and piston engines. That said, they were headline news when they popped up, totally proved the concept that Dosman and Keller believed in, and showcased the building prowess of Pete Farnsworth to create this machine from scratch, a style of car no one had seen before, and have it not only be functional, but a legitimate record-setting beast. The story of the Blue Flame and its 630-mile-per-hour record-setting glories, all precipitated by the lessons learned on the X-1, is another story to be told another day. Dick Keller has a wonderful series of videos here on YouTube that can take you through it in ways I'll never be able to, and I would highly recommend you checking them out. In my mind, the X-1 should stand as a larger piece of drag racing history than it currently does. There are but scant few vehicles in the history of the sport that can say they pioneered totally new technology into the world of drag racing. X-1 is among that small group. It was successful. It was a launching point for an iconic American land speed effort, and it was born of three curious guys who were never told to stop, never told they couldn't do it, and never once lost belief in themselves and their mission. The 5-second, near 270-mile-per-hour drag car of the 1967 and 68 timeframe is an exceptionally cool thing. If perhaps its lifespan was longer than the mechanical kind of mayfly it was, it would probably receive more love in the history books, but alas, it doesn't. There is a happy ending to this story to some degree. The snowmobile version of the X-1, the Sonic Challenger, was recovered intact, and Pete Farnsworth got his mitts on it. Using that as his foundation, Farnsworth has completely restored the X-1 into its perfect period form. The car exists to be gawked at by people who may still not totally believe its performance, especially out of that strange little rocket motor in the back. Somewhere, Chuck Suba is still smiling about it all. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more high-thrust, low-drag, gearhead history. See you next time.